Hello, this is Michael David Cobb Bowen for Cobb Vision. This morning, I'm following up from Anna DeVere Smith, who has a video up at a new site called Big Think. And Big Think is a collaborative enterprise of video testimony, I guess, some of whom is from experts and some of whom is from individuals. And the wonderful thing about this is it is kind of a confirmation of one of the ideas that I've had a long time, which is to have a encyclopedia man. I grew up in Los Angeles, and of course spent a lot of time at the beaches as a young kid. And Venice Beach is notorious for having all the hippies and roller skaters, and one of the guys who used to hang out there was called the Swami, and he would go on these long rants, and of course then you'd have people in aromatherapy, and they didn't have that in the 70s, but there was something like that. And anyway, I always secretly wished that there was a professorial kind of guy who would sit out there with a row of Encyclopedia Britannica, and instead of selling horoscopes or fortune telling and all this mystical stuff, he would just come up with the straight answers to people's questions. So there's 10 questions that they have. Excuse me. And the one that Anna DeVere Smith answered was, how did your childhood affect you? So I figure I'd take on that particular question in my own series of video stuff that I'm doing. I grew up in Los Angeles in 90016 in a neighborhood with very nice street names. I grew up on Wellington Road, next to Virginia Road, over by Somerset and Victoria. So I guess I've had always an affinity for these Victorian English kinds of names. And on the other hand, we also had presidents in the names of our neighborhood too. So I lived near Jefferson, and then about a mile north of me was Adams, and then a mile north of that was Washington. So I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood, a city kind of neighborhood. It was mostly single-family houses with front yards and backyards, and street lights and trees. And I always used to think of my childhood a little bit like Huck Finn. We were kind of the blacks that moved into this neighborhood, and the last of the white families was moving out. So there weren't more than one or two white kids in my elementary school by the time I got there. This was a very uniquely black and Japanese neighborhood in Los Angeles. Majority black, I would say 90%, maybe 10% Japanese. And it was an interesting experience. I never went to school with any white kids until I was about 14 years old, until literally high school. But I grew up as part of a big family, and we lived next door to even a bigger family. And like I said, I kind of thought of it as kind of a Huckleberry Finn childhood. All kinds of adventure, danger, a lot of autonomy as kids, a lot more autonomy than my kids have, and I think that kids have today. The only kids that really seem to be as autonomous as we were would be kids on skateboards, because nothing that they do, and I live in the suburbs today, is directly controlled by parents. It's unique in that way. But we had a lot of pickup sports, a lot of tag games, a lot of hide and go seek games, capture the flag. We lived in a neighborhood with dozens and dozens of kids. Like I said, there were 5 kids in my family. There were 8 kids in the family next door, 5 kids in the family across the street. Everybody had nicknames. Everybody had bicycles or skateboards, and we just had like a 1 square mile area in our neighborhood where we were free to roam. We were kind of in between gang areas. There weren't gangs in our neighborhood, so we had normal friendships and fairly normal, if roughneck, sensibilities. We had fights, we had fist fights, but we never had knife fights, and certainly we didn't have gun fights. But all of that kind of took over the neighborhood by the time I was of college age, and kind of I was the oldest, and I used to hang out with the oldest. We were kind of the kings of the neighborhood, and we took care of our little brothers and sisters and maintained order, but it wasn't like a gang style, and the parents were still in control, obviously. And I come from one of those old school neighborhoods where the parents of some other kids could beat you if you had to, and it was a mix of blue collar, of poor, of white collar. I often make political points talking about my neighborhood with regard to a couple things. One, when I look at class within African America, I say there are 5 classes: the projects, the ghetto, the hood, the burbs, and the hill. And we're definitely the hood. We're right in the middle of that. But even within the hood, it's kind of compressed. I mean, even we had apartment buildings. We had 4 apartment buildings on our block, and 20 single-family homes. So it's mostly homes, but some of the poor kids lived in the apartment buildings, and the old folks lived in some of the apartment buildings as well. But there's a kind of compression because you live with folks of varying values, and it's kind of a mixed blessing, because in one way, because you're all black folks and you're forced to live in one place, you have to be more diplomatic. You can't just talk about people disparagingly because your kids played with their kids, and you had to make peace. We formed a brotherhood out of necessity, whereas suburban life, you live with people who you think are like you, and there's a lot more conformity. So those are 2 things I think in terms of contrasting suburban life with life growing up in the hood, is that we don't necessarily now have to be so diplomatic because we're in our specialized kind of place, and we understand that what's to be expected within our demographic, and so the brotherhood and the bonds are not quite as strong. And also, we're a little bit more controlling, and kids don't run free. But I came up from that era with a strong sense of independence, a strong sense of community, but also, on the negative side of community as well, where you feel like you're bound up with people that you don't necessarily want to be bound up with. And it's kind of a theme in my current writing when I talk about class, because we were kind of raised almost in a chicken coop, where the reason that you're in this black community, you have to believe in some black unity, because that is the only institution that you have. We didn't have a feeling like, for example, there was no strong union in our neighborhood. There was no element of power in the larger society that came out of institutions that we were a part of. There was Family Savings had their headquarters in our neighborhood, just about a mile south of where we lived, and it was the tallest building for 5 miles around, the Family Savings headquarters. And they had large statues of a black family there, and it was very symbolic. And they used to have church bells that rang on Sunday morning that played chimes or played songs. And so there was always a sense that there was some strength within African America. We were all calling each other black folks at the time, and I can remember before that when we were Negroes. So even though there was this unity and there was this friction within the unity, there was never a feeling of desperation. There was a feeling of kind of being an outsider, knowing that there was another world that we would have to go to in order to, and other skills that we would have to gain in order to get out of the hood. And we sat at the bottom of Baldwin Hills, View Park, Ladera, some of the richest black community in the country, if not the world. So there was always something out there that was better, and it was within our reach, and we never felt like it was not within our reach. And since we, as the oldest kids in the neighborhood, kind of kept track, we knew who the knucklehead kids were, we knew who the uncool kids were. We always had a feeling that, we could determine right from wrong, and we knew who was going to be cool and who was not going to be cool, and who was going to make it and who was not going to make it. And I think that's a kind of unique thing that I've recognized, in that I did grow up in a neighborhood where the parents were still in charge, where the older kids had responsibilities for the younger kids, where there was a feeling of unity as well as a feeling of friction, where there was a real meritocracy that we controlled and we maintained, where there was always hope, and where, you could see, like I said, a parallel to the adventurous life of Tom Sawyer. I mean, we were kids who were climbing on roofs and going in other people's backyards and raiding fruit trees, and we had every kind of fruit tree imaginable. We had been a big avocado tree in our backyard, and then a plum tree next door, and then peaches and oranges and lemons and pomegranates and apricots and jacaranda, big huge jacaranda trees, and we just had it wasn't a concrete jungle. It was a neighborhood with real neighbors, with real lawns, with berries that grew on the bushes that we would have berry fights, and a lot of good memories from that. We'd go swimming, we'd run jogging on the railroad tracks, and we were not particularly self-conscious. We knew that we came from a different place and that the world was bigger and it was going to be different. But it was generally an attitude that let me know that I had a full, happy childhood. That I wasn't, the expression that we say, we didn't know how poor we were, but we were rich in spirit, if I can abuse that cliche. So I look back on my childhood, I think mostly positively. I mean, I recognize the structural issues that I talk about when I engage in politics, but I don't think I lacked anything, lacked any experience. I was considered often as an underprivileged kid, and I just wasn't spoiled. That's all. My kids have a lot of privileges, and they're not spoiled either. But they do have maybe twice or three times as many privileges as I did. I mean, we had a bike. Our bikes were better than their bikes, and we knew how to put our bikes together and take them apart and put them back together again. My kids don't know that. As far as identity is concerned, I understand and recognize that my children are not going to be black like me. They can't, because my blackness was born of a particular time, of a particular place, a particular moment in American history. That's not going to repeat. And I always had a strong sense of family within the black community, within the community that I grew up in, and I know that my parents appropriated blackness and interpreted it through the family. It was like, okay, you know, there are sayings out there that says like the only thing I got to do is be black and pay taxes, but we never let race become more important than family, and so we couldn't exactly say that. And now I certainly have to be myself and be the dad and be the runner of my family, and I pay as little taxes as possible. So there's certainly a wider horizon that I see for myself and my family, that transcends some of the limits that have traditionally been associated with being black, with being African American. And I don't mind being on the cutting edge of that. I'm always kind of a pioneer, and that's the way I feel about it. I'm always one of the kids on his bicycle, you know, going as far as possible and coming back and say, hey, look, I just found a new place where we could jump our bikes, or you know, I found another fruit tree in the neighborhood, check this out. So yeah, I think my kids are going to have the advantages of understanding a little bit more of how America works politically and economically, you know, the kind of things that you can get by growing up in an upper middle class neighborhood. I was, as a kid also, I mean, I was the teacher's pet, the smartest kid in school, and so I was always surprised at the level of isolation that I endured. I mean, as a black kid in a black neighborhood, you know, we would watch the moonshots, and my favorite astronaut was Michael Collins because we had the same first name, and so I would ask any kid named Collins, it's like, are you related to Michael Collins, the astronaut, or any kid named Armstrong? Are they related to Neil Armstrong? Or any kid named Campbell? Or are they related to the soup company? And nobody was ever related. Nobody was ever hooked up or connected. And that was always I always felt like we're far away from where anything is really happening. We need to go to where things are happening. And I still have something of that in myself. Because, you know, in terms of where we were in the black community, we were very closely tied up. I mean, I was there, and you know, it's kind of my claim to fame, is that I was there at the first Kwanzaa, and we knew Ron Karanga, and we did hang out at the Aquarium Book Center, and we were friends, close personal friends with the Lagans, who ran the Aquarium Bookstore, which was the first and largest black bookstore on the West Coast. So there were connections there, and I actually did meet Stokely Carmichael, and I do know the people who helped build King Hospital. And so there was a kind of connectivity within the black community that we had, where we could go about as far as that went. You know, I knew where, you know, Congressman David Cunningham lived, right up the block. And I still, to this day, every once in a while will find some people who are very well connected within the black community. But within California and the larger mainstream community, you know, you're more degrees of separation away. And I was always painfully aware of that. So I think my kids are going to have a much better chance to be more connected. And it's a class thing, and there's the connections thing and the who you know. And it's going to be a lot easier for them to make those connections if they so desire. And I feel like my kids are going to have a little bit less difficulty with their ambition, but also less difficulty if they have a lack of ambition. You know, if you had ordinary kids in the hood that grew up and they just wanted to hang out with their same friends all the time, there was a kind of, well, you ain't nothing and you ain't never going anywhere and all you are is blah blah. And I think that's true of everyone who doesn't necessarily want to transcend the boundaries of their own community. I mean, what's wrong with staying in love with the people that you grew up in love with? And so it's going to be more okay, I think, for them to have less ambition. And I kind of say that right in line with the Shaker Heights study. And we don't always need to progress. We can just, hang out and be God's children, and that's good enough. So that's where I was as a child. The only other thing I could add to that would be, that I was a big reader, and I read science fiction, and I remember reading Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury before I was even in junior high, or maybe as I was just getting into junior high. I became a big science fiction fan. And I always wanted to be an astrogator, which was the guy who was not as arrogant as the pilot and barking out orders, but saying, okay, this is exactly where we are, and this is where we're going. If you don't pay attention to me, then you're going to get lost. And so that was my early scientific love that I still have, and that's why I'm in computering. So that is about all I have to say about my childhood for this video. And this is Michael David Cobb Bowen for Cobb Vision. Peace.